Picture this. June 1941. German panzer crews, veterans of lightning victories across Poland and France, suddenly freeze in terror. Through their periscopes, they see something impossible. Soviet tanks bouncing their shells like rubber balls. Rounds that had torn through every Allied tank now ricochet harmlessly off sloped armor. German commanders frantically radio headquarters with the same panicked message. We need better guns. We need bigger guns. Nothing we have can stop them. What they encountered wasn't just a tank. It was the T-34, a machine so revolutionary that it would force Nazi Germany to completely redesign their armored forces, inspire Allied tank development for decades, and ultimately help decide the fate of World War II. This is the story of how Soviet engineers created a weapon that changed the course of history. To understand the T-34, we need to rewind to the late 1930s. The Soviet Union knew war was coming. Stalin's military planners watched anxiously as Nazi Germany rearmed and expanded, and they understood that the next great war would be won or lost with tanks. But there was a problem. Soviet tank design was falling behind. The Red Army's main battle tanks, the BT series and the T-26, were adequate for their time, but had glaring weaknesses. Their armor was too thin, their guns too small, and their designs were based on outdated concepts. Soviet tank crews in the Spanish Civil War and during border clashes with Japan learned painful lessons. When bullets started flying, these tanks became steel coffins. Soviet High Command issued a desperate directive: design a new medium tank that could dominate the modern battlefield. The specifications seemed almost contradictory. It needed thick armor, a powerful gun, high speed, and reliability, all while being simple enough for Soviet factories to mass produce by the thousands. It was a design challenge that would have seemed impossible to most engineers. Enter Mikhail Koshkin, a dedicated tank designer working at the Kharkov locomotive factory. Koshkin and his team, including brilliant engineers like Alexander Morozov, took on this seemingly impossible task with revolutionary thinking. They wouldn't just improve existing designs, they would rethink what a tank could be. The T-34 that emerged from Koshkin's team incorporated three groundbreaking innovations that, when combined, created something unprecedented in armored warfare. First, there was the sloped armor. While other nations built tanks with vertical armor plates, the T-34's armor was dramatically angled. This wasn't just an aesthetic choice, it was physics turned into protection. When a shell hits sloped armor, it has to travel through more metal to penetrate, and it's more likely to ricochet entirely. The T-34's front armor was angled at 60 degrees, meaning a 45 millimeter thick plate provided the equivalent protection of 90 millimeters of vertical armor. German Panzer III and IV tanks, with their near-vertical armor, couldn't match this efficiency. Second came the gun, a high-velocity 76.2 millimeter cannon that could punch through any German tank's armor at combat ranges in 1941. While German tanks carried smaller 37 millimeter or 50 millimeter guns, the T-34's weapon gave Soviet crews a decisive advantage in firepower. Later models would upgrade to an even more devastating 85 millimeter gun, ensuring the T-34 remained lethal throughout the war. Third, and perhaps most ingenious, was the Christie suspension system and wide tracks. The T-34 mounted broad tracks that distributed its weight, allowing it to traverse mud, snow, and rough terrain that would bog down German tanks. When the autumn rains turned Russian roads into endless seas of mud, the infamous Rasputitsa, T-34s kept moving while German armor sat helplessly stuck. This mobility was as much a weapon as the gun itself. But the brilliance went deeper than individual components. The T-34's diesel engine was more fuel efficient and less flammable than the gasoline engines in German tanks. The overall design prioritized simplicity and ease of production over crew comfort. There was no turret basket, limited visibility, and cramped conditions, but these compromises meant Soviet factories could produce T-34s in numbers that would overwhelm their enemies. When Operation Barbarossa launched on June 22, 1941, German forces expected to sweep aside Soviet resistance in weeks. Their panzer divisions had conquered Poland in days and France in 6 weeks. The Wehrmacht had earned a reputation as an unstoppable force. Then they met the T-34. German after-action reports from the summer and fall of 1941 read like horror stories. Panzer crews described firing round after round at T-34s with no effect. The standard German 37mm anti-tank gun, nicknamed the door knocker by German troops, was completely useless. Even the 50mm guns on Panzer III tanks struggled. German General Paul von Kleist would later state that the T-34 was the finest tank in the world. The psychological impact was devastating. German troops who had believed in their technological superiority suddenly faced an enemy with better equipment. Tank crews requested immediate upgrades. German High Command convened emergency meetings. Some generals even suggested copying the T-34 design directly, though this idea was ultimately rejected due to production complications and German pride. The German response took 2 forms: tactical and technological. Tactically, German forces learned to use coordinated attacks, superior tactics, and the famous 88mm anti-aircraft gun in the ground role to counter T-34s. Technologically, Germany accelerated development of the Panther and Tiger tanks, heavily armored and gunned behemoths designed specifically to counter the T-34 threat. The Panther, in particular, borrowed heavily from the T-34's sloped armor concept. But here's where the T-34's story becomes truly extraordinary. The tank's greatest advantage wasn't just its design, it was that Soviet industry could build them in staggering numbers. Soviet factories produced over 84,000 T-34s during World War II. Let that number sink in: 84,000. To put it in perspective, Germany produced about 6,000 Panther tanks and just 1,347 Tigers. The United States built around 50,000 Sherman tanks. No other tank in history has been produced in such quantities. This wasn't easy. When Germany invaded, many Soviet tank factories fell into enemy hands or came under threat. In one of history's most remarkable industrial achievements, the Soviets dismantled entire factories. Every piece of machinery, every tool, every blueprint, loaded them onto trains and evacuated them thousands of miles east beyond the Ural Mountains. Workers reassembled factories in Siberia and the Urals, sometimes beginning production before buildings had proper walls or roofs. In the brutal winter of 1941-42, Soviet workers labored around the clock in sub-zero temperatures to keep T-34s rolling off production lines. The design's simplicity was crucial here. T-34s could be built by workers with minimal training, using rougher tolerances than German tanks required. While German Panther tanks demanded precision engineering and careful assembly, T-34s could be manufactured quickly and repaired in the field with basic tools. Soviet maintenance crews could swap out an entire engine in under an hour. This mass production transformed the Eastern Front into a war of attrition that Germany couldn't win. Even when German tanks achieved kill ratios of 3 or 4 to 1, it didn't matter. There were always more T-34s. Soviet tank commanders developed a grim joke. A Tiger tank might destroy 10 T-34s, but the 11th T-34 would destroy the Tiger. The T-34's finest hour came in July 1943 at the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle in history. Germany had spent months preparing Operation Citadel, amassing nearly 3,000 tanks and assault guns, including their new Panthers and Tigers, for one decisive blow to regain the initiative on the Eastern Front. The Soviets knew the attack was coming and prepared an elaborate defense, concentrating thousands of T-34s in layered defensive positions. When the German assault began on July 5th, it ran headlong into a prepared Soviet defense in depth, with T-34s forming the backbone of Soviet armor. The battle at Prokhorovka on July 12th became legendary, a massive armored clash involving hundreds of tanks in close-quarters combat. Soviet T-34 commanders, knowing their armor was vulnerable to the new German tanks at range, deliberately closed to point-blank distances where their guns could penetrate German armor and where German advantages in optics and gunnery meant less. By the battle's end, Germany's offensive had failed catastrophically. The Wehrmacht would never again launch a major offensive on the Eastern Front. Kursk marked the point where Soviet industrial might, exemplified by endless waves of T-34s, overwhelmed German technical sophistication and tactical skill. The T-34 continued evolving throughout the war. The T-34-85 variant, introduced in 1944, featured an enlarged turret with an 85mm gun and improved crew ergonomics. This version gave Soviet crews the firepower to tackle German heavy tanks more effectively and remained the Red Army's main battle tank through the war's end. But the T-34's influence extended far beyond World War II. After 1945, the Soviet Union exported T-34s to Allied nations across the globe. The tank saw combat in Korea, in the Middle East, in Africa, and in countless Cold War conflicts. Some T-34s remain in service with militaries even today, over 80 years after the design's inception, a testament to its rugged reliability. The T-34 influenced tank design worldwide. Its sloped armor principle became standard on virtually every tank designed afterward, from the American M48 Patton to the British Centurion to modern main battle tanks. The emphasis on mobility, firepower, and protection, balanced with mass producibility, became the holy grail of tank design. Soviet tank design continued the T-34's philosophy through the T-54/55, T-62, T-72, and modern T-90 series, all spiritual descendants emphasizing practical effectiveness over crew comfort, maintainability over sophistication. Behind every T-34 were human stories. Soviet tank crews faced horrific conditions. The tanks were cold in winter, hot in summer, noisy, cramped, and dangerous. Visibility was poor, communication difficult, and life expectancy in combat measured in weeks. Yet these crews fought with determination and courage, knowing they were pushing back an existential threat to their homeland. There were heroes like Lieutenant Alexander Fadin, who destroyed 7 German tanks in a single engagement, or Captain Dmitry Lavrinenko, credited with 52 tank kills before his death in 1941. Female tank crews served with distinction, breaking barriers in one of warfare's most physically demanding roles. The workers who built the T-34s were equally crucial. Women, teenagers, and men too old for frontline service worked in human hours under brutal conditions to maintain production. Some workers inscribed messages on shells and tank parts. For Moscow, for our motherland. Personal notes of defiance to the invaders. So, why did the T-34 change World War II? It wasn't just that it was a good tank, though it was. It wasn't just that it shocked German forces, though it did. The T-34 changed the war because it represented a complete system, revolutionary design, mass production capability, tactical doctrine, and strategic vision working in concert. The T-34 proved that in industrial warfare, practical effectiveness mass-produced trumps technical perfection in limited numbers. It demonstrated that clever engineering solving the right problems matters more than solving every problem. It showed that protecting your crew adequately while prioritizing production speed could win wars that protecting them perfectly in smaller numbers could not. When German generals saw the T-34, they realized that the Soviet Union wasn't the backwards nation they'd expected. Soviet engineers and workers had created something that forced Germany to rethink its entire approach to armored warfare. By the time Germany responded with Panthers and Tigers, it was too late. The T-34s kept coming in numbers Germany couldn't match. The T-34 helped turn the tide on the Eastern Front, and the Eastern Front decided World War II. While Western Allied efforts were crucial, the vast majority of German military power was destroyed in the East, ground down in battles where T-34s formed the armored fist of Soviet counteroffensives that drove from Stalingrad to Berlin. Today, if you visit tank museums around the world, you'll find T-34s displayed prominently, often with reverence. Military historians consistently rank it among the most influential military vehicles ever created. Its distinctive silhouette, the sloped armor, the long gun, the wide tracks, has become iconic. The T-34 wasn't just a tank. It was the embodiment of Soviet determination, engineering ingenuity, and industrial might. It was proof that wars aren't won solely by superior technology or tactics, but by the combination of good enough technology, mass production, and the will to use both effectively. In the crucible of the Eastern Front, the T-34 earned its place as the tank that changed World War II.